morning. It is January the 26th, 2018, on Friday. And I hope that you have had your TVs rescanned because Channel 6 is no more. Channel 6.1 is our channel now. So stay tuned for a very interesting program on the history of the Zodiac. We have Jane Curtis here in the studio with us, and she has done some research on how the Zodiac happened to come to be, and why, and how, and when, and all those goody questions. So Jane, take it over.
Good morning. Well, we're going to talk about this interesting subject and a deeper subject than one might think. I'm going down to think of the Zodiac and just Chinese restaurants, you know, and
right.
Forecasting and curtains twitching and fortune tellers and things like that. But that's far, far from what it is. Let's start right out with a picture. We're going to look at a series of pictures, more or less in order. This is the difficult subject to try to categorize because everything feeds into everything else. But this one is a very nice shot. It's a modern made of Zodiac, and it has on it the traditional pictures in their traditional order, which is interesting. And then in the second circle in, you see the mystic signs for it. The top one of those looks kind of like an H, but the next one, you wouldn't be surprised to hear, is a goat, represents
right.
a goat, or a ram, sorry, a ram. And the next one with the little horns, it represents Taurus the bull. And the third one, that's a double thing, represents the twins, the sign of the Zodiac and so on. So they, this is a very, very nice one. It's very, very clear and pretty. You can see it's relatively modern down there at the bottom. You have Virgo as a definitely modern-looking woman than some of the others. The next shot will show us sort of a clean view of that, as it were, with the names filled in. And I don't know if any of you pay attention to astrology, which is this kind of side interest here, but you would know what your own sign is. And again, you notice that the signs in the innermost circle there will tally with the meaning somewhat. You see Aries there at the top, and you see a ram's horns, and you see then the next one down from it, Taurus. You see a kind of stylized bull with horns, and Gemini, the twins, and so on. This goes way, way back, farther than you might think. And you can picture people long ago when people first were, well, more like what we are today, in that they could think and put things together and use tools and do all that. They could see the night sky probably a lot better than we can in most places in the earth. But they could see that, and they were somewhat mystified by it, and it probably took them at least a few generations to catch on to the fact that things repeated, but they didn't repeat at the same time of year. Here was one of the important functions that later developed: seasonal, determining the seasons, being able to forecast, because they don't come in steady order. They noticed that the sun and the moon and the stars tended to stay in a certain path. They weren't just all over everywhere. They also noticed that there were star patterns. They made them into patterns very early. Really? Archaeological finds show drawings that you can easily recognize. And it looks steady and unchangeable to us. It is not, of course. It's going very fast. And the one thing that I know that they have determined a slight change since early Egyptian days is in Orion. And one of the three sword stars that are in a row, the top one is just very slightly off, you can see. They were perfectly in a row at the time in early Egypt days. But we have, at any rate, a picture of these people who could see these things, and they learned, particularly in Mesopotamia, Babylon, Sumer, that they maybe could tell fortunes that way. Well, they could certainly start to judge the seasons that way and what fit in when. Quite an interesting thing. Now, whether it began in Babylonia, Mesopotamia, or began in Egypt, I don't know. Egyptian is dated by some at least 14,000 BC because of some things they've found. And there's some other calculations they made that indicate that there were people there building things, doing things, noticing, using the stars to determine the seasons and so on, as early as 10,600 BC. So you see already that this thing is a venerable.
Right.
Now, this is where your circle and your line of the zodiac comes from. The zodiac, of course, comes from word circle of animals, and they are mostly animals in all the places. There were people observing, using it seasonally, and there were people using it to sort of navigate by. If you went out, people didn't like to get very far from land in their boat or on land. They didn't want to get lost, but they would know that at a certain time of year when certain constellations were in a certain spot, it was going to get warmer or going to get colder, and they'd know to move their flocks. So this is the ancient, and we're pretty sure of all this was going on because very early finds from archaeologists in Mesopotamia, in Armenia, in the mountains there, they found things scratched on rocks. And some of the symbols go way, way back. And you can see why. They had animals, they knew about animals, and then they had rudimentary tools, and of course they had people. Using it, the sky for any purpose like that depended upon your having some lines that you can depend on. You know, the way we use a map. Looking at this map, these lines have nothing to do with what's there really, except they tell us. They enable us to pinpoint what's where.
Right.
And in the sky, we have done similar things, so that navigating, we have instruments, you can use them to navigate, but it's tricky. Now, when we look at this globe, we see that it rotates on its axis. Actually, it rotates from west to east, but this wants to stick it in here.
Doesn't want to turn that way.
Now, if this were perfectly straight up like this, every day when we looked out at the sun, no matter where we were, we would see it head on, so to speak. And tomorrow when we moved again, we'd see a direct line across. So why doesn't that happen? It doesn't work that way. Now, it turns out that, see, there's a plane of our orbit. When we go around the sun, there's this, you can think of it as a flat plane, if you like. But our rotating here in our globe, now if you were to hold it this way, see, if it were straight like this, you wouldn't have these seasonal changes.
Right.
Nothing. But it's this way. And this is the way it formed, and this is the way it is. And this means that when we look at the sun and these things, of course, it's always going to appear against a different background of stars because we're going around it. But because we are tilted, it's not always the same. See, at one season of the year, we're going to be tilted. If you're the sun, it's going to be tilted this way, and then half a year later, it's going to be tilted this way. And this means that the sun, you being over there, see, this half is going to be illuminated, and this half is not. So you can see where we get our seasons. Now, the zodiac, the reason I go into this is that the zodiac was a very key thing in recognizing and coping with this fact, realizing that this is what was going on out there. So long, long ago, people could look at the sky and determine where something is. You can do that today. You can say, oh, I looked up and I saw a little explosion in the sky. It must have been a little meteorite. Where was it? Well, it was 10 o'clock at night, and I saw it just under Orion's belt. Well, there you are. You see, you can use it right there. You don't have to go into degrees or anything of that nature. So the Zodiac circle of animals had that one developed very, very great use there. Now the Egyptians took it up, not for predicting or reading conical bones or anything like that. To them, it mimicked the circle of life and existence, because everything for them, the main deity rode across the sky. You think of Apollo later rode across the sky and went down at night. And this pattern changed, however, as things tilted a little bit. Now, later on, the Babylonians used it more as a religious thing, and this is where your astrology really comes into the picture, and where the zodiac takes on these meanings with fortune tellers use. But it wasn't just fortune telling for them, it was for real, really forecasting what was going to happen. And they had a lot of deities, as did the Egyptians. The deities had a goddess of the heavens and a god of the earth and so on. Let's look at the next picture, please. And this just illustrates a little bit now of what is happening. If you see us going around the sun, and you see us then, if our axis, you see our axis is tilted, you can see from where the equator is how we're going around. If it were straight up and down, that would be easy. You would just go around, there'd be no complicated calculations. But it's not, it's this way. So again, you can see that at different times of the year, sometimes on the sides there it's going to be even. That's when we have our equinoxes, the spring and the fall. And they're also when this line of the sun and the planets crosses over that. Now, I'm not going to go into this any farther. I think Eck would disapprove heartily. He never liked getting in anything technical. He said, people don't like that. But a little technical, I think, helps us to see
it helps us understand
some of the
a little
uses
more
of this thing, which was not just a toy, or a spooky Madame Blavatsky kind of thing, or 1920s parlor game. No, it wasn't. But let's look again, please, and we'll see the next. Well, this one just is a broad picture of it here. Now, the next picture will show us a little further on that. Here's our globe, and it's as though we're inside of a big glass ball. They're not square edges, that's why you can't measure by straight line out there. But you could see, you see our equator right in the middle there, and it's just a projection outward of ours. And then you see the path of the sun and the planets at an angle to it. And the reason they are in this, they're in a band of about 20 degrees wide, and they're all within that band. We are within that band, and it's just simply because they were formed that way. Presumably the sun threw off a lot of material and it turned into the planets. This is a rough description of what they think happened. But you can see then that there's plenty of opportunity for using these planets, which have given rise to the zodiac, to time things, to time seasons, even to time the day. The Egyptians had water clocks. They're called clepsydra, and they were made inside of kind of like a fat section of a cone. And inside, they would inscribe them. They had them in bands, and they would inscribe them with things from the zodiac, and then put water in, and the water dripped out a controlled hole in the bottom, you see. And they used then these things they were familiar with to determine the hours of the day. And apparently they worked rather well. So this doesn't show the line on it, but again, that's what was happening there. The Babylonians, the Sumerians, Mesopotamians, those folks were much more into the predicting, as I've said, but they also were great mathematicians and astronomers to figure out what was going on. Let's look at the next picture, please. This is a stone that was found in that area somewhere, and this goes back, at least into the second millennium BC. Not only is it a beautiful carving job, but it has bands on it, and these bands are zodiac, not in a circular form, but you can see clearly there, you have the animal and you have the scorpion type, the crab-like creature. So this, they've proven that, as I say, it goes so far back that people were just doing it before they even knew much else. But they were very, very great astronomers and mathematicians, clear over into India, and then down into Egypt. But the Mesopotamians were the specialists in this type of thing. Next picture, please. This is an early picture from the Babylonian astronomy. This is a sort of zodiac in a way, because they were aware of the planets. And it is a zodiac on the form. I'm sorry I couldn't find a better picture of that, but it shows the 12 constellations around there, and the planets as they were known then in the middle. They formed constellations, they know, very early, again because they found, archaeologists have found scribbled on stones and manufactured more in a more professional way later on, these groupings of stars that you can still recognize today. Again, because the changes, they're going at huge rates of speed, but they're so far away that they don't seem to change to us. But you can clearly recognize parts of Orion. You can recognize the Big Dipper and some things. It was more to the south because things were attuned more to the south. We see more in the south, actually, because that's more or less where the center of our galaxy is. You see less from the north. But this is proof positive that these things were there and were going on, and they still exist today. We don't use the zodiac for forecasting so much as was done in the past, but you sure can use it as a rough and ready locator thing, and you can notice the grouping into constellations. We still use those same constellations, and they're a very, very big, broad way of saying, it's roughly where Orion is when it comes up, or whatever, Leo the lion.
Right.
The zodiac now exists. We can see several signs of the zodiac from our position on Earth in the course of the year. If you look out there now, for instance, you could locate Orion pretty easily, and to the right of it you would see a bright star, a very bright star, and that would be Aldebaran, and it would be in Taurus. It's the red eye of Taurus the bull. So there's Taurus. And you realize, you've got one of the zodiac constellations. And the band, of course, is going to appear off kilter to us because of the fact that we're off kilter to the system. And we have made our thing that way. But yeah, you would be able to find Leo the lion. You would be able to go back to Orion and sight through its corner stars, lower right and upper left, and come to the twins up there. And you can do that wherever stars are visible and whatever part of the globe you're on, you can see some of that. So it's pretty fascinating, I think. Now, another picture, please. This is the only good one I have from Egypt, good picture. And this is an example of one I'm not even sure that's supposed to be a zodiac, nor are the scientists who have worked on it. But this was found when Napoleon was in Egypt, as were so many other things. It's called the Dendera Zodiac. Dendera is a place in Egypt. And you see these things that seem to be sort of hanging on. Not quite sure what they are unless they're designators of the solstices and the equinoxes. A lot of these things will tell you where their year began. Our year begins in the spring, but everybody's year didn't begin in the spring. They took different beginnings. We'll see that as we look at some more. But this, now this other one this Egyptian one, I wish I had a better picture. It's the only picture I could find. That represents the goddess Nut. And this is painted on the ceiling of a tomb, which was very often done, and sometimes in the temple buildings, great buildings. But she is a tall figure here. She's the goddess of the sky. She's normally on her hands and her stretched out legs, arching over the earth. And she's a source of astronomy, what we see in the sky, the source of rain, all these good things. But and the picture here now on the sides, which I'm really sorry, if you take a magnifying glass, you can trace a couple of the animals. But the 6 things that are closest to her are signs of the Zodiac, almost identical to what we have here, and used for that purpose. One more shot at her, please. Look at that one. At the very bottom of it represents, well, the 2 side things represent, they thought the Nile had 2 sources that came out of 2 things. And whether they knew about the Blue Nile or not, how it came in, they don't think they knew about that yet. But they considered anyway that it had 2. And it's in one of the reports we read in hieroglyphics that it explains about that and the water levels. Please stay on that a little more. And underneath that, then, you can maybe you can make out there's a kind of a beetle or a bug down there.
Yes.
And that, well, it's supposed to be the key thing, the resurrection of life, the rebirth of everything through. They use a dung beetle of all things. They were not. They didn't always pick the prettiest examples, but then the prettiest examples weren't always the good ones.
Right.
But the dung beetle rolls balls of dung around and thereby creates a new life. Then it dies off and new life pops out of the old. And you see this in literature. This is a motif all over everywhere. But how do you keep track of that? Well, the Zodiac kept track of the seasons and the Nile. They knew from their astronomical things there when the Nile was going to inundate. And their year had only it had 3 sections. It had 12 months, the magic number 12 all over. It had the 3 sections, and they were the inundation, 4 months, and then 4 months of planting and harvesting, and then 4 months of winter, quote unquote, in between there. And they kept track. The Zodiac was supposed to come when they saw this, first could see the star Sirius and rise in the morning. And for 7 years, again, we read this actually in hieroglyphics. For 7 years, the Nile did not inundate. Apparently, of course, it comes originally from the mountains in Central Africa, and you can figure yourself what must have happened. But they knew it was supposed to be there. I mean, here it was, and they kept track of astronomy very closely, and they eventually got off the track because they were counting 360 days to the year, which it was at one time. And they hadn't yet put in their 5 extra days. But you can see all of this, the key role that the Zodiac played, not only astronomy, but the Zodiac, in naming these constellations and keeping track of what was where and which one meant what. This was one of the things that helped get them. Now, this picture, that picture was one of their main deities, the goddess Nut, surrounded by Zodiac. This is early Christian one. This is the Christ in the middle, surrounded by these very same things. And these are very good and recognizable pictures. And each one, if we had a lot of time, we could go into all the ins and outs of each one. But some indicated that to them that the hot season was coming. They were named after our deities oftentimes, or animals that were particularly beneficial, or animals that they wanted to imitate, good qualities, be like this animal. Now we've gone on to this is the Chinese. You can see from the middle there, the yin and yang thing indicates that. The Chinese is one that uses only, I think only animals in the Chinese, and they're different. This is the only variant in the content. The others are almost 100%, something the same, identical or related to it. But anybody who's been to a Chinese restaurant, of course, has seen seen something like this, and you know what year you are. I know I'm the year of the rabbit. You see down here on the right, there's a picture of a rabbit, and it gives some of the years. Now they went on a 12-year cycle, and they followed, it's called a Jovian cycle after Jupiter. They did that because Jupiter takes 12 years, here's the magic number 12, to go around the sun. Its year is 12 years. So they divided this by 12 and got 5. So they acted on that and used those numbers, and their system was to use this, every 5 years was a cycle in there. Okay. And then they couldn't, I suppose they were using it in between for one thing or another. But this lets you know that they knew about Jupiter, and they knew that it moved around. And you can begin to see the calculations involved, say in our own present day astronomy and then space, because you not only had the Earth turning around, or rotating, you had it going around. And each time when it came back to its starting point, it moved, because we're going around in the orbit. Right. You had that going on. You had things within our own planet. You had the other planets exerting pulls. So extremely, extremely complicated. And the little old Zodiac still sits there as a handy way of saying this part of the sky or whatever you want from that. And the planets, of course, participate to some extent. They aren't always shown. Whether they were in the Babylonian one we looked at, the early one, the second millennium BC one, they looked at. But the one. Let's see that one once again. The one with that you just had. Yeah. Well, no, one more back from that. This one, this Christian one, this goes back to the 6th century A.D. and this is the 500s A.D. This is the King Arthur period, very early English period. And then as you move forward, the Chinese are relatively recent on it. The Chinese presumably got it via the Silk Road. Oh, okay. Because it one of those things that does not seem to have originated there. They were astronomers, but I guess not as talented ones as the others. But it reached China, and here now is a Hindu zodiac. Mm-hmm. Here's a different religion, different time, different place. Of course, the Hindus were, to some extent, the heirs of these early people, and partly the heirs of that area. But you see again, the animals in the same order. Mm-hmm. And again, they were seasonal indicators and important things. I'm not sure about the thing in the center, but I am sure that it had this religious connotations. And oh yes, thank you, that's good. Because you can see, for instance, here's a ram and a bull, and you can also see that at the top, many of these considered Aquarius, the beginning of the year. See, there's a little bit to the right there. And because, various reasons in history there for that. But Aquarius, and then it moved on to Piscis, the fish, and then comes Aries, where we count the beginning of the year. But these same figures that, a couple millennia before that were appearing on things. That one looks like a woolly mammoth. That bull looks more like a woolly mammoth than a bull, but there are your twins, and the whole shebang. So, where do we stand on time? Can we consult one of these?
We have 2 minutes.
Oh, 2 minutes. Mm-hmm. Okay, next picture. There's Scorpio. This is a fascinating one. This comes from the Jewish history of Judaism. This is a mosaic floor from a Jewish temple that goes back to, let me see, I've forgotten the exact year of this one. I think this one was in the 1st century BC, if not the 1st century after. But there you see, there are those same animals shown somewhat differently. but you have the scales. I think this is the one. I mean, I don't see it. It's more often somebody holding the scales. This was extremely important to the Egyptians to keep that, because that's what determined your afterlife, your after death fate, whether your good deeds would balance.
Right.
With Osiris. But there you have it in another place and time, another whole religion. It crossed religions. It was one thing that was a great leveler there, because you had, of course, Christianity, you had Islam, you had Judaism, you had Buddhism. The Chinese didn't seem to have used it for that, but whatever their whatever their standard was, it meant that.
Yeah. Okay, we're into our last minute.
All right. Well, that's well timed. Now, this one is also one that I don't believe is from an original source, but it's in the form of, they're arranged as this little rectangle, but they're very nice representations. And you had a beginning of the year, and you had the fish, great significance in Christianity. Then you had, you went on from there to the bull, come on,
Taurus.
the ram and the bull, Aries and Taurus, and then you had the twins and Scorpio, or no, not Scorpio, the Scorpion. This was also one sometimes. No, Scorpio, I think, is the best name for it. The idea there was the taking hold, I think, and then on from there to Leo the lion. Lion, the symbol, of power and strength, and Virgo, the Virgin. This is usually, in Christianity, of course, associated with Virgin Mary. And there are some of the religious ones, the Christian ones, that even have her holding baby Jesus, and there are others that have that same thing. And here are your scales, your Libra. Now here is Scorpio, and Scorpio is protection. The Egyptians certainly looked upon these dreadful things like cobras and vultures and scorpions as protective. They revered them heartily. They kept their distance. They knew how to avoid the worst part, but they also knew how protective they were. And then on to the end of the Zodiac there. So I think it's a deep, deep study, and people who think
fascinating.
It's just it was a little fun in the 1920s,
Right.
Oh, my grandmother used to, have seances. No, it's more than that.
It's very fascinating. Yeah. Thank you so much, Jane.
You're welcome.